Okay, so good evening, everybody, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us this evening. Really honored to be joined by the two speakers we have this evening, Rahima, Mahmut, and Ben Rogers, who I'll hand over the platform to in just a moment for an extremely important conversation. Just before we begin, by way of very, very brief introduction. So this week, we've begun reading the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus, and we learn the story about, Bnei Israel, the Jewish people, when we became slaves in Egypt. And we learn about our leader, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who was the great leader who took the Jewish people out of Egypt, out of slavery. And it's very interesting. The Torah tells us about his early life, 3 very, very short stories. The only details that we're told are 3 stories, but the common theme in all of them is about fighting for justice, about standing up for injustice wherever it may be and against whomever it may be perpetrated. And we have 3 stories. I'm going to go into detail now. It's not a Parsha class. But the first one involves a Jew being oppressed by an Egyptian taskmaster. The second one involves that arises between two Jews. And the third one is 2 outsiders, as it were, a case with the shepherds at the well, and people who are completely foreign and completely removed from his own community and his own circle. And what we can see from all of these stories is, as I said, just how important it is to stand up, to fight against injustice wherever we see it, against whoever it's perpetrated, whether it's within our own circles or whether it's further off as well. And the topic, obviously, we're going to be speaking tonight about the Uyghur Genocide. And 2 speakers will tell you very, very much more about this issue. First of all, we've got Ben Rogers, who is a human rights activist and journalist based here in London. And he's going to give us a little bit more of a sort of a general background as to what's going on and what are the issues and things that we should all be aware of, and maybe what we can do practically as well. And after that, we're going to hand over to Rahima, who is known very well to the Jewish community as awareness is raised about this issue, and is going to tell us a little bit more from a personal perspective. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben.
Well, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Great. Well, thank you so much firstly for the invitation, and to everybody for coming. And Rabbi Koenigsberg, thank you for that wonderful introduction, which I really identify with the theme of justice and freedom. And that's really the theme that Rahima and I will both be focusing on tonight. Can I also, despite these challenging times that we're all in, can I wish you all a happy new year? And let's hope that 2021 brings better news for all of us and for the world. And particularly, let's hope it does lead to some breakthroughs for the part of the world that is our focus of these thoughts this evening. It's a real privilege to be with you and to share this platform with my good friend and colleague, Rahima. And I want to begin, before I get into the subject, by really paying tribute to the Jewish community for its leadership on this issue. I'll say a bit more about that during the course of my remarks, but I've been deeply inspired by the courageous leadership that a number of key figures and publications and organizations in the Jewish community have given to this issue. And of course, from your history, you can, of course, understand and relate to the issues that we're going to be talking about tonight. So I want to thank you for that. We are witnessing in Western China today one of the gravest human rights crises of our modern times. Increasingly, the evidence suggests, and international experts argue, that what is happening to the Uyghur people in what is known by the Chinese authorities as the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but preferred to be called by the Uyghurs as East Turkestan. What's happening there, increasingly in the view of international experts, amounts to genocide. That has not yet been legally proven, and there are mechanisms underway to move towards that, and I'll come back to that in later on in my remarks. But without doubt, mass atrocity crimes are being committed, and it really has the feel of that well-worn phrase, "never again," all over again. But before I unpack further the Uyghur situation, I think it would be worth putting the persecution of the Uyghurs in a somewhat broader context. The Chinese Communist Party regime under Xi Jinping has really embarked on the most severe crackdown on human rights since the Tiananmen massacre of 1989, and arguably the worst assault on religious freedom in particular across the board since the Cultural Revolution. And although the plight of the Uyghur people, which is our focus tonight, is without doubt the most egregious part of this picture, let's always remember the repression that continues and intensifies in Tibet, with reports just in recent weeks of forced labor very similar to what we're seeing with the Uyghurs. Let's not forget that persecution of Christians in China has increased very severely in recent years. There's a wider crackdown on lawyers, on civil society, independent media, and all forms of dissent. In fact, I saw a cartoon on social media today that was a cartoon of a person in prison, and the caption out of his mouth was, "I want to talk to my lawyer." And the image in the same cartoon of a man in the next cell, and the caption was, "I'm in here," which was a shocking and shockingly true statement. Lawyers are being rounded up and jailed and disappeared. There are reports of forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience, including, but not limited to, the Uyghurs. And of course, as we've seen in the news, the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, autonomy, and the rule of law, and increasing threats to Taiwan, and growing aggression by the regime abroad. So that's the bigger picture. I've been in and around China since I was 18 years old. I first went to teach English in the city of Qingdao on the East Coast for 6 months. And I fell in love with China as a country. And I always want to emphasize that when I criticize the Chinese regime, it's the Chinese Communist Party regime that I'm critical of. And I am deeply pro China as a country, China as a people, the different diverse peoples of China. And it's the regime that is the problem. So I've spent much of my life, my adult life, in and around China, traveling many times. I did a master's in China studies. I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover of Hong Kong. And today I'm immersed in all these different issues that I've outlined in various capacities with an organization called Hong Kong Watch, with Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which focuses particularly on religious freedom for people of all faiths and none, and with the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign, which I work with Rahima on. So that's my brief introduction, but let me now turn to the key question that brings us together tonight, which is what is happening to the Uyghurs and what can we do about it? The Chinese Communist Party regime's campaign against the Uyghurs is, I would say, multifaceted. The most serious part of the picture is the fact that at least 1 million, some estimates put it as high as 3 million, Uyghurs are incarcerated in concentration camps, where they are subjected to horrific torture, slavery, and sexual violence. CSW, one of the organizations that I work with, recently published a report titled "Repressed, Removed, and Re-educated: The Stranglehold on Religious Life in China." And that report, in regard to the Uyghur situation, describes how Uyghur Muslims have been detained for some of the following reasons: having relatives living abroad, accessing religious materials online, visiting other countries, engaging in communal religious activities, or sometimes simply no reason at all. Inside the prison camps, reports indicate that conditions are dangerously unsanitary and overcrowded, and detainees are subjected to beatings, sleep deprivation, forced medication, and solitary confinement. At a hearing in the United States Congress in 2018, a Uyghur activist, Miragul Tursan, described her experience. And I'm sorry that this is going to be quite graphic, but I think we owe it to them to give you a picture of the full horror that they're facing. She said in her testimony, "I was taken to a cell which was built underground with no windows. There were around 60 people kept in a 430 square foot cell. We had 7 days to memorize the rules of the concentration camp and 14 days to memorize all the lines in a book that hails the communist ideology. They forced us to take some unknown pills and drink some kind of white liquid. The pills caused us to lose consciousness. I clearly remember the torture. I was taken to a special room with an electric chair. There were belts and whips hanging on the wall. I was placed in a high chair that clicked to lock my arms and legs in place and tightened when they press a button. My head was shaved. The authorities put a helmet on my head. Each time I was electrocuted, my whole body would shake violently and I could feel the pain in my veins. I thought I would rather die than go through this torture, and I begged them to kill me." Religious freedom is suffocated in the Xinjiang region of China, with mosques and shrines of religious, cultural, and historical importance to the Uyghurs destroyed, religious sites transformed into so-called tourist spots, Uyghurs compelled to perform their culture for tourists, and Uyghurs who display any form of religious piety, prayer, reading the Quran, fasting, abstaining from alcohol or pork, wearing a headscarf or having a beard of any particular length can be jailed. And sometimes they're forced to drink alcohol or to eat pork. As a recent report written by Adrian Zentz, an academic who's a specialist on the Uyghurs, reveals, the regime is conducting a campaign of forced sterilization of Uyghur women, targeting 80% of Uyghur women of childbearing age in the 4 Uyghur majority areas of the Xinjiang region. And according to the 1948 Genocide Convention, this act of forced sterilization is one of the criteria for defining genocide. Towards the end of last year, a very courageous Uyghur doctor told ITV that she had personally conducted between 500 and 600 operations on Uyghur women, including forced contraception, forced sterilization, and forced removal of wombs. And Uyghurs are being transferred to other parts of China for slave labor in factories manufacturing for high street brands. Let's return to this question of genocide, and then I'll come back to the question of slavery. I began my remarks by paying tribute to the Jewish community for its leadership in speaking out on what's happening. And that was particularly illustrated in July last year when the president of the Board of Deputies in this country wrote a letter to the Chinese ambassador in London in which she said that nobody could see the evidence and failed to note what she described as, quote, similarities between what is alleged to be happening in China today and what happened in Nazi Germany 75 years ago. People being forcibly loaded onto trains, beards of religious men being trimmed, women being sterilized, and the grim specter of concentration camps. But it's not only the president of the Board of Deputies who said this. The Jewish News highlighted the discovery of 13 metric tons of Uyghur hair on the front page of its newspaper. And I believe I'm right in saying that the Jewish News is the only newspaper to run stories about what's happening to the Uyghur on their front page twice or at least twice, maybe more than that. The widely respected, one of my own personal heroes, the late and very great former Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, wrote these words: knowing our history, the sight of people being shaven-headed, lined up, boarded onto trains and sent to concentration camps is particularly harrowing. That people in the 21st century are being murdered, terrorized, victimized, intimidated, and robbed of their liberties because of the way they worship God is a moral outrage, a political scandal, and a desecration of faith itself. And all of this, I feel, is extremely significant because I know that comparisons with the Holocaust are extremely rare and should never be lightly made, and that time in history was a unique horror. So to see that repeated and the repeat being acknowledged makes the point especially powerfully. Leaked high-level Chinese government documents last year speak of, in their own words, absolutely no mercy. China's state media has declared that the aim of this crackdown on the Uyghurs is, quote, to break their lineage, break their roots, break their connections, and break their origins. And as the Washington Post put it in an editorial, it's hard to read that as anything other than a declaration of genocidal intent. Adrian Zentz, who I mentioned earlier, has said this. He's described it as the largest detention of an ethno-religious minority since World War II. While Joanne Smith-Finley, another academic expert, has described what she calls a slow, painful, creeping genocide. Even the United Nations, which has its faults and its weaknesses, but the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has described what's happening as, has described the region as a massive internment camp shrouded in secrecy, a no-rights zone. And it said that Uyghurs are being treated as enemies of the state based on nothing more than their ethno-religious identity. Last year, the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, for the first, perhaps the first time, came close but not far enough to acknowledging the severity of the situation. He did acknowledge that gross, egregious human rights abuses were going on, which were reminiscent, in his words, of something that we have not seen for a very long time. But he stopped short of calling it genocide, emphasizing that one has to be careful about that legal term, genocide. And in a sense, he is right. Genocide does have a specific legal definition and should never be used lightly. But being careful should not mean being inactive. And so calls on the international community to determine what legal term to apply to this catalogue of horrors facing the Uyghurs have so far received no response, or very little response. Having said that, momentum is growing. Last year, 50 United Nations special rapporteurs called on the UN to establish an investigative mechanism into human rights in China. The Bar Human Rights Committee of England and Wales published a paper on what the international community could do. Last August, 76 faith leaders from all major religions, including the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, called for investigation and accountability. In fact, I had a part in helping to organize that letter, and I was actually on holiday when I did so, and somebody said, how did you spend your holiday? And I said, I spent my holiday chasing bishops, imams, and rabbis to sign on to this letter, but it was well worth it. And we had these 76 signatories, not only the former Archbishop of Canterbury and 7 Anglican bishops, 2 Asian cardinals, the Coptic Orthodox Archbishop, 20 rabbis, more than 20 Muslim clerics, the Dalai Lama's representative, the chief executive of the Humanists UK, an American Southern Baptist, and Jonathan Aitken, who's now an Anglican vicar. It's not often that that group of people come together, and this is one issue that has brought them together. And they say in that statement that the suffering of the Uyghurs amounts to one of the most egregious human tragedies since the Holocaust. They say, we have seen many persecutions and mass atrocities, all of which need our attention. But there is one that, if it is allowed to continue with impunity, calls into question most seriously the willingness of the international community to defend universal human rights for everyone, and that is the plight of the Uyghurs. After the Holocaust, the world said never again, the faith leaders say in their statement. Today, we repeat those words, never again, all over again. We make a simple call for justice, to investigate these crimes, to hold those responsible to account, and to establish a path towards the restoration of human dignity. Other people have been courageously raising their voices as well. Majid Nawaz, a prominent Muslim counter-extremism activist, went on hunger strike for the Uyghurs and promoted a petition that called for a parliamentary debate on the imposition of targeted sanctions on the Chinese regime for its treatment of the Uyghurs. The Anglican Bishop of Rochester called for sanctions in a debate in the House of Lords. The president of the Asian Catholic bishops, Cardinal Bo of Myanmar, highlighted the plight of the Uyghurs. I'm sad to say that amongst the growing number of religious leaders of all faiths that are speaking out, that there are still two that have not yet really said anything. And they are Pope Francis and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. And I'm happy to comment on that further if you want to raise that during questions. So how do we take all this and lead to something that would address the questions of accountability and ending impunity? Well, first of all, it's worth mentioning that a new independent tribunal has been established to address this issue. It's chaired by the British barrister Sir Geoffrey Nice, who was the man who prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic in The Hague 20 years ago for genocide in Srebrenica and other crimes in the former Yugoslavia. And he's an expert on international human rights law. He's been involved in addressing the genocide of the Rohingyas, crimes against humanity in North Korea, and other major human rights issues. And now he's taking on the 21st century's, one of the 21st century's most egregious tragedies, the situation of the Uyghur. So he's formed the Uyghur Tribunal, which is an independent people's tribunal. It follows in the line of similar bodies over the last few decades that were started, in fact, with the 1966 inquiry that Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre started into the Vietnam War. And a people's tribunal is a body basically set up to do what governments and multilateral institutions should themselves do, but either refuse or fail to do, and that is to establish the truth. It's initiated by civil society. It doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. It has nothing more than moral authority. But in an age when that is a scarce commodity, it is of considerable value. Its judgment may or may not lead to action, but it can certainly remove all excuses for inaction. And so that independent tribunal on the Uyghurs is now underway. What else could be done? Well, we should pursue this call by UN special rapporteurs for the establishment of a UN mechanism. We should be urging the British government to use the new Magnitsky sanctions legislation that it has in place now to apply targeted sanctions against individual Chinese regime officials who are responsible for these atrocities. We should be looking at the complicity of companies, and there are a range of dimensions to this. One very simple example is the role of Disney in its film released last year, Mulan, which was filmed in the very region which houses concentration camps, and actually with the partnership of the Chinese Communist Party authorities. And so I've been supporting a boycott Mulan campaign, and I would encourage you to do the same. We should look at the 2022 Winter Olympics, which are going to be held in China. How can a regime charged with such a litany of human rights crimes any longer deserve to host the Winter Olympic Games? So we should either see whether that can be removed from them, or if that's not possible, we should look at least a ban on VIP attendance. Members of the royal family, members of the government should not go to the Winter Olympics if it's held there. We should encourage a consumer boycott of the games as well. We should also think of individuals who are in prison. There's an individual today whose case has been highlighted, who, in fact, whose birthday, I believe it is today, a young man called Ekpar Assad. And he was sentenced to 15 years in the concentration camps after he returned from studying at Harvard in the United States. And the organization Burst the Bubble, which I've had some contact with, and I know there are some wonderful Jewish students in that group, have mounted a campaign for him. And then there's the issue of the cotton trade and its links to the high street brands. More than 80% of China's cotton is grown in the Uyghur region, approaching almost 20% of global production. And a group of many human rights organizations have been campaigning to address this. Actually, the Center for Strategic and International Studies goes further in saying that the Xinjiang region produces more than 20% of the world's cotton and is the third largest producer of cashmere in China, and China is the world's largest cashmere producer. And this leads to major products that are sold in high street brands. I won't name all of them, but brand names that you'll know: Calvin Klein, Adidas, Gap, Marks and Spencer, Nike, Polo Ralph Lauren, Tommy Hilfiger, Victoria's Secret, and others. As the executive director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project says, given that so much cotton is sourced from the Uyghur region, the fashion industry is uniquely culpable for forced labor and by extension systematic policies to destroy the Uyghur identity. So those brands could be enabling forced Uyghur labor and supporting, as he says, an entire system of genocidal repression. He asks the question, who is picking the cotton and stitching the clothes that Western consumers are wearing every day? Uyghurs, drawn directly from mass internment camps. Now, of course, Uyghur slave labor is not confined to the fashion industry. As a major report titled Uyghurs for Sale last year details, at least 80,000 Uyghurs have been transferred from Xinjiang to other parts of China to work in factories that form the supply chains of at least 83 global brands across the technology and automotive as well as clothing sectors. The United States has actually taken the step of banning exports from 5 sectors in Xinjiang and 1 or 2 other provinces in China, saying, as a US government spokesperson said, that these extraordinary human rights violations demand an extraordinary response. This is modern day slavery. Campaigners have highlighted the fashion industry's role, and that is very welcome, but there's more to be done. There's a coalition of NGOs, which CSW and others are part of, that's launched a campaign called "Sorry, China, I'm Not Buying It." Because do we really want to be buying consumer products made by slave labor that is part of a genocide? Gulzira Alkan, a Kazakh woman who was formerly detained in a concentration camp and then subjected to forced labor, described the situation in this way. She said, "The clothes factory was no different from the re-education camp. There were police cameras, you couldn't go anywhere. There were also credible reports that in some cases, factories are in the same compounds as the camps." So the onus is on corporations, but with consumer pressure, to ensure that they're not implicated in this system of abuse and violations of international law. Some of the brands named have responded positively, have promised to look at their supply chains and reiterated their commitments to not to use forced labor, but there's a need for more pressure on them to follow suit. Let us, for example, keep up pressure on Volkswagen. You don't need me to remind you that Volkswagen only finished paying reparations to the Jewish community for its use of slave labor in the Second World War at the turn of the millennium, just 20 years ago. And that begs the question, how long will it be before Volkswagen will have to pay reparations to the Uyghurs? As I draw towards a conclusion, history is never kind to appeasers of tyranny, but I believe it does reward, at least eventually, those who stand up for freedom. And so I've outlined a few of the things that can be done, but I think there is one particularly urgent thing that I would really encourage you to do. And I believe we circulated a page with action points that, so you can have a look at that in more detail. But there is very urgently coming up in a matter of a couple of weeks, an amendment in the House of Commons to the trade bill. And this is an amendment that was quite astonishingly passed in the House of Lords just before Christmas by a significant majority. And it's an amendment that essentially says Britain will not do trade deals with regimes that are committing genocide. Now, how do you determine genocide? Well, what this amendment does is it argues that if the government is not going to make a genocide determination, then a case can be brought to the courts in this country. And if if the High Court in this country determines that any given situation amounts, based on the evidence, to genocide, then the government will be required not to agree or indeed to revoke if a trade agreement is in place and to stop trading with such regimes. As Lord Alton, who introduced the amendment, said in the House of Lords just last month, as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, we are required to prevent genocide, to protect those affected by genocide and to punish those responsible. But if no judicial authority declares a genocide to be underway, then at the moment, the status quo is we're not obliged to act, and hence there's a vicious circle. The practical effect of this was illustrated by the Armenian genocide of 1914 to 1923, and which is still unrecognized by the United Kingdom. He quoted Hitler's infamous remark as he carried out the Holocaust. Hitler himself said, "Who now remembers the Armenians?" In a debate in the House of Commons, a member of parliament spoke movingly about the Uyghurs, saying, "If we look on, history will condemn our unforgivable cowardice and ask why those in power did not act. Increasingly, we might ask," this is Lord Alton speaking, "who now remembers the Tibetans? And in the future, will other perpetrators of genocide ask, who now remembers the Uyghurs?" And we must not let that happen. As one of the signatories to the faith leaders' letter, Imam Mamadou Bokoum says, "We say never again, yet we never learn from the past. We had Srebrenica, Rwanda, Cambodia, and now we see signs of genocide and cultural wipeout in China against the Uyghurs. We must stand up for this ancient culture and people now and stop China's mass persecution of them. Failure to call the Chinese regime to account won't simply weigh on our consciences. It actually may well imperil our own liberties too, because as that regime becomes more aggressive and expansionist abroad, and if it's allowed to carry out what it's doing to the Uyghurs, and as I outlined at the beginning, to other people under its rule, it will be emboldened to continue to be more repressive at home and then to threaten freedom beyond its borders as well. So let us act now to ensure that not only the Uyghurs are remembered, but that their elimination is prevented, and let it not now be never again, all over again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for that presentation. Not easy to listen to, certainly the first part, but very important. And I see there's a number of questions that have come through. We will hopefully get to questions at the end. So I'm going to leave those for now, ask people just to be patient. And now we're going to move on to the second part of the evening to Rahima Mahmut, who's going to give us a more of a personal story on this. Just for those who don't know, Rahima is a Uyghur singer, human rights activist. She's an award-winning translator of the poignant prison memoir, The Land Drenched in Tears. She's been a translator for the BBC as well. And currently she is the UK project director of the World Uyghur Congress. As I mentioned, she has a very personal connection to what's going on. And I'm now going to hand over to Rahima to please share with us some words.
Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thank you so much for inviting me and to speak at this very important event. And thank you so much for Ben. I think you said almost everything. Thank you. That was really a great outline of what is happening to my people. I'm Rahima Mahmut. I'm Uyghur, and I was born in a city called Gulja. It's a northern part of what I call East Turkestan, and the nearest border city is Almaty, Kazakhstan. Uyghurs, we are the Turkic Muslims, and the homeland, East Turkestan, we consider is our historical homeland. And the Turks also originally came from Central Asia. They also, the historic homeland, Eastern and Western Turkestan. Since I was born, the one thing I learned from very young age is be careful. Don't say this, don't say that. For example, my parents, when they prayed and they locked the gate from inside and said, do not tell other people we prayed. My father often said that if you tell others, police will come and take me away. That was the latter years of the Cultural Revolution. And later, after Mao died in 1976, situation has changed, mosques reopened, and Uyghurs enjoyed relatively good freedom, I would say. So growing up from my primary school and secondary school, then to the university, and then 1989, the students' democratic movement took place in Beijing, I was one of the many hundreds of thousands of students joined the Tiananmen student movement, traveling from Dalian University of Technology, where I was doing petrochemical engineering degree. I traveled along with 2,000 students, mostly Chinese, to join this movement. And of course, people might know this, and June 4th, the massacre happened. I left the square on the 2nd of June. And going back to my country after obtaining the degree, I couldn't find a job in the capital. At that time, they were recruiting the Chinese students going to Chinese provinces, mainland China, and offering extra incentives for Chinese to come to the region, take jobs. And so I mentioned this, the root cause of the problem, if anything, is very much the marginalizing, discrimination, deeply rooted racism that is been happening for many, many years. Since the occupation 1949, even though in 1955, the CCP declared the region as a Uyghur autonomous region, but they never honored that status. From 58, the rightist movement, then Cultural Revolution, it killed most of the elites, cultural figures, business people, you name it. And after this brief 10, 15 years of relatively better freedom, and from 90s, the situation gone back again. The human rights situation just became worsened. And in 1997, winter, it is actually February the 5th, or 1 month from now, the Rolja massacre in 1997. And that day I was in my, I visited my mother with my son, who was a year and a half old. Peaceful protest crushed the military, killing over 100 Uyghurs on that day, then followed by mass arrest. 4,000 to 5,000 Uyghurs, mainly young male, imprisoned. In 1999, the Amnesty International documented 195 executions. So you cannot even hold any kind of peaceful protest anymore. And that was the event that made me to decide to leave my country. I was a teacher then. So in 2000, I obtained the visa, student visa, to do a master's degree here in the UK. And I came 2 years later, and my son joined me. And since then, I couldn't go back because of my activity. Since I arrived here, from day one, I have been speaking, telling people about Hua Uyghurs, what is happening to the Uyghur people. But I was able to speak to my family. I have 9 siblings, 4 elder brothers, 3 elder sisters, and 2 younger sisters. I kept a very, very close contact with them, speaking to them almost weekly. And then in 2016, from October, I couldn't get through to anyone. Then on the 3rd of January, after making numerous phone calls, and my brother finally answered my phone call. And when I asked him why no one is answering my phone call, and he said, they did the right thing and leave us in God's hands. And that is my last last conversation, and it has been 4 years now. 4 years now. I don't know what happened to anyone. And this new year, I had this kind of, what can I say? Almost wanted to risk it and call one of them, but then I know that action can only lead them to pay very heavy price if they are at home and if they answer that phone call. So this is the situation since 2017, April, from my work as a translator, some very important documents, and also the interviews that the Radio Free Asia conducted with some officials, Uyghur officials in the region. We learned that this mass arrest was happening. In fact, in 2009, the Rimchi massacre happened in the July 5th, and I'm sure a lot of people must have watched the CCP state media report how 200 Chinese, mainly Chinese, killed. But in fact, they never reported how many Uyghurs gunned down before that riot started again. So after the July 5th, 2009 massacre, the extrajudicial killing, extrajudicial arrest implemented. And from that time, we know a huge number of people were disappearing almost daily. But then from 2017, we know now from the leaked document, the concentration camp, the plan didn't start in 2016 or 2017. It was planned in 2013 when they started the 工作小组, the working group, sending working group formed of 6 people to all the villages, neighborhoods to check out people and study everyone's past 20 years history. And that was a time that they were selecting people who should go first to the so-called re-education camps. And so now we know almost 3 million, maybe more, of my people are in these camps. The people not in camp, they are not free. Chinese government sent 1 million the cadres to Uyghur families. These cadres, mainly male, and they have to live with the Uyghur family 5 days every month to monitor what they do there, whether they speak Uyghur language, whether they practice religion, whether they eat pork or they strictly halal. And every 200 meters, there are checkpoints. So Uyghurs, wherever they go, they are every movement 24/7 is monitored. In order to arrest as many Uyghurs as possible, they set up the joint, integrated joint platform using the surveillance camera and to collect the data. And the data connect to the computer is directly connected to the Public Security Bureau. And 24/7, computer automatically select people who is dangerous, who is suspicious, and who is normal. And based on this popped up data, color red, dangerous, immediate police either summon them to the police station or go to the house, arrest them, take them away. And now the most famous, well-known, all Uyghur scholars, poets, writers, musicians, wealthy philanthropists, any cultural figures who had a good influence among the Uyghurs, all taken away. And I know 4 former president of 4 universities. 2 of them we heard that given suspended death penalty. We don't know what happened to them. So this is absolutely a horrible situation. I just want to read out one of the interview, the record that I translated recently. This is for the BBC, and a new program will be on soon. We don't know the date. And so I know Ben already mentioned quite a lot what is happening inside these camps. But we also know mass rape is one of the systematic state policies. So Guzira, the earlier Ben has mentioned, who is also one of very few detainees managed to leave the country because they're Kazakhs and they had Kazakh passports. That's why they left. And this is what she said in recent interview. My job, so she was there 15 months, and the last 3 months she was ordered to work in the camp, doing cleaning and other things. And this is what she said in tears. My job is to remove the girls' clothes completely and then handcuff them on their bed so they cannot move. And Tursunay, who recently arrived in the US, Uyghur, who married a Kazakh doctor, who spent also many months in one of the concentration camps in Kunes, is where I come from. It's the outskirts of the Ghoja city. Because of the torture and the heavy kickings that she suffered, the bleeding didn't stop. And then I know only recently her womb was removed in the US hospital because they just realized there is no way, no any other way. She doesn't have even any children. And this is how she described when she arrived the camp. Everything changed. This is second time, she says. Everything changed so dramatically. On entering the gate, we must pass through a checkpoint. They pulled out our earrings so roughly and caused my ear bleed. Uyghur girls from 6, 7 years old, we wear gold earrings. Family, it's a kind of tradition. So that was just pulled out, causing bleeding. And they herded us into a room in a hurry, as there were so many people. The scene is still clearly in front of my eyes. From the 8th of March, mass arrests started in Kunes, which lasted 3-4 days. When I arrived, there were 4 buses parked in a line. Police were ushering in people non-stop. I, along with 4 to 5 other women, one of them was an elderly lady. I forgot to think about myself. When my earring was pulled ruthlessly, my ears bled badly. But I didn't think about my own trouble. Looking at the others around me, I was completely lost. There were elderly women. Among them was a lady called Grandma Salim Khan, who I shared same cell later. I watched how they aggressively pulled off her headscarf while shouting, "Why are you wearing a long dress?" They arrested people for wearing long dresses at that time. And here, this is another what happened to her. She said, every evening after midnight, there will be 2-3 men wearing masks and glasses would walk along the corridor. And then they call out the names of the girls and they took them away. And she said she didn't know, she thought they were taken for questioning, but only when she experienced it, then she knew what happened. So perhaps this is the most unforgettable scar for me forever. I don't want the words to spill out from my mouth to tell anyone. It is so difficult for me to talk about it. I wish to forget even to think about it. But because I think that our entire fellow countrymen might be subjected to it, and I know I am a finished person. There were 3 men, not 1, 3. They did whatever evil their mind could think of, and they didn't spare any part of my body. They bit everywhere, leaving horrible mark to the extent that it was disgusting to look at. I've experienced that 3 times. 3 times. I'm sorry to tell you this, but I feel it's my responsibility to tell the people what they are going through in those camps. And it's very hard for me to even say these things, but I also know I normally is a person who like to bring joy and happiness. I like to sing and I love, to make people smile. But I'm sorry if I made you very upset tonight. Thank you for listening this very, very difficult talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahima. Thank you so much for being with us, for sharing those words. You say difficult talk, and I'm sure that as difficult as it was to listen to, much, much more difficult to say and difficult to share. So thank you for that, really, for the, all the courageous things that you are doing. And we pray that you should be reunited with your family. We pray for their safety. We pray for the end of the suffering for all of your people. They should know no more, and this should all come to an end very soon. I know there were a few people wanted to ask a few questions. I think the easiest way we'll do it now is just if anybody has questions they would like to ask either Ben or Rahima, if you can just use the raise hand function in the chat, open up the chat on the side, and there should be an option to raise your hand. If anybody wants to ask something or wants to make a comment, maybe in the meantime there's 1 or 2 questions that have come through from the chat. That we can look at. So Ben, I think this is going back to you, but just a couple of questions again, maybe a little bit further in terms of what we can do. So there's a question that's come through here. Somebody's asked, can Britain take practical steps to sanction Chinese business interests here, given the huge investments in Western European countries? Should we and can we sanction the party apparatchiks personally so that they get the message? There's also a question here about the Olympic Games in 2021, whether China could be banned from that. Also a question about China's having a seat on the Human Rights Council.
Thank you very much. Those are excellent questions. I think on the question of sanctions, there's absolutely no reason why we can't impose targeted sanctions. I think starting with the targeted sanctions against individual officials in the Chinese regime, as I mentioned in my remarks, and as the person who asked the question says, so that they get the message. I don't know if you're all familiar with the Magnitsky sanctions that were the sort of brainchild of a man called Bill Browder, and originally they were focused on Russia, but they're now global, and we have legislation for Magnitsky sanctions. A number of other countries have such legislation as well. and that is legislation that would impose targeted sanctions on key individuals. And I think that now we have that legislation, we we really should be applying it to Chinese government officials who are responsible for these atrocities. In terms of sanctions against key Chinese businesses, yes, I also think that is possible. I think it's probably unrealistic given how integrated China is in our economy and the world economy. It's unrealistic to have a sort of blanket sanction against China, and not necessarily desirable either. But I think targeted sanctions against key state-owned enterprises and sectors that are directly or even slightly indirectly complicit with what's going on. So companies that are, for example, some of the tech companies, Huawei and others, that are directly involved in providing the surveillance technology that's creating the apparatus of repression, those I think should be targets for sanctions. I'm pleased that after a lot of debate at the beginning of last year, the UK has reversed its position and is not going to have Huawei in our 5G telecoms infrastructure, and that's a good thing. But I think we could go further and look at other companies and sectors that are complicit with the atrocities. On the question of the Olympics, absolutely. As I mentioned in my remarks, I think we should be looking at what we can do there. And actually, the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign has some initiatives on that, and we can provide more information in that regard. On the question of the UN Human Rights Council, I agree in principle with the sort of the premise of the question. That's probably the hardest of all the things. I think sanctions are achievable. It's up to us and our governments to deliver them. Something on the Olympic Games is achievable. Getting China removed from the UN Human Rights Council, well, it's also achievable next time round if we can build an alliance of like-minded countries to vote them off. And I think one of the things we should be doing in the interim before we can get to that point is actually to be really strengthening an alliance of democracies and of like-minded countries that will stand up for values of human rights. And once that alliance is strengthened, we may be able to reach a point at some point further down the line where we have the numbers in terms of votes to vote China off. So that's maybe a bit further down the line, and there's some steps to take in between. But I think I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. I think there's just another question here with regard to the respect to the fashion industry, as you mentioned. You know, a lot of these brands that are sourcing their products based on slave labor. But the question is, you know, even if we refuse to buy products that are made in China, maybe products from other countries are, you know, sourcing these materials in the same way. So how do we really address that issue of the supply chain?
I don't know if Rahima wants to take that one, or do you want me to have first go at it, Rahima? Okay, I was only looking at Rahima because I know she's been very involved in this particular issue. But I mean, I think one of the things we should be doing, and this is beginning to be talked about. I think the pandemic from the beginning of last year has begun to cause governments in the Western world, the democratic world, to begin to rethink their relationship with China because of the way the Chinese regime wasn't truthful and wasn't quick and tried to suppress the truth about COVID-19 at the very beginning. That has caused some rethinking, and I know that one of the things that is being discussed, we need to push it further, but it is the whole idea of reducing our strategic reliance on China and diversifying our supply chains across lots of different sectors. So I think we should be doing that anyway. We should be looking at sourcing materials from other countries. But that doesn't address the question that's asked here of even if we boycott products made in China, won't other countries still be doing so? Yes, I mean, I think that's where we need really this kind of international coalition of countries that can develop these things together. But I don't know, Rahima, if you want to add something on that.
No, it is very difficult. I understand that, but boycotting Chinese product, I mean, if like a large number of people can do that, that will hurt the economy. And but what is devastating is that we just learned recently, was it last week, EU signed a trade deal with China, and just based on their empty promises that they are not going to use slave labor. So I think the most important thing is how we can use our people's power to lobby and to try to put pressure on the government. At the same time, we also be mindful of our own buying habits, especially like mobile phones, for example. You should never, ever touch Huawei phones made of Huawei. Even the electronic products, or even though they're not talking about slave labor, but we know that all the supply chains in China, everything is tainted by slave labor.
Thank you, thank you both. I think we'll leave it there. Ben did mention that there was a page with some action points, just some of the things that we can do, some of the places we can write to, and some of the buying habits that we can change. We have that page, and that will be circulated after this meeting. If anybody is interested in getting further involved or has more questions, please be in contact. But again, I just want to thank you both. I want to thank Ben for your words tonight, and for all that you're doing, and Rahima as well for your extremely powerful, impactful words, and for sharing with us from your story. Thank you both.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for initiating this and for having us.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
It was incredibly powerful. Thank you very much. We need to take that away.
Thank you.
Forward to continuing to support.